Hey guys, this is the kind of a DAP, but this is kind of the setup first. So it's kind of how to get configured and how to set the session up and how to set your car up based on the baseline. This isn't going to get actually into any tracks and getting around. So this is kind of uh, the video that works for basically the TCR in our league, Extreme Motorsports99. Where we usually run about 12 gallons of gas. So the first thing I want to do is just show you how to kind of set up a test session because the weather can have a dramatic impact on the track conditions and how the car handles. I'm kind of going through the legacy UI. I'm kind of an old holdout and don't use the beta unless I have to. There's a couple places you can go, but the league tries to keep both of these in sync. But I just noticed that if you look down here, so if you go to the league, you should see the upcoming race. I click on this, get on the, or don't click on this, just hover over the little info button here, and you can see it will show you the weather settings. So here it's showing 74 degrees. Actually, sorry, this is updated. So it's 74 degrees, 8 miles an hour, etc. You can also go to the Extreme Motorsports, the series page. In fact, let me go home first just to show you guys if you haven't gotten here before. Alright. So when you're in here, you can go to the series, and we are the Sportscar Series. So from there, you can scroll down, you can see what the next event is. This weather actually right now is not updated. The only reason I know it's not updated is because my last test session, when you go in here, you can adjust the weather. It's the same settings, but it looks, and when I checked last time, the league session was the same as the website. So now it has been updated. Usually I'll write these down off to the side, but we're going to try to do a little memory test here. So I have 74, 72, 72, this was 8, and I think this was southeast. Let's see here, 8 southeast and partly cloudy. But what we can get from the website is also the time. So the time here, the in-sim is what you're after here. You don't really care about the local times and stuff like that unless you're gonna miss the race. But the in-session time here is going to be race beginning at 3:15. So we can check that inside the session when we get there. But that should be pretty close to afternoon. Late afternoon, I think, starts around like 5 o'clock or something like that. So I'm going to put it at afternoon, and hopefully it's close. Track state should be at 40%. I think that's what it is on all of our races. I know it's in here somewhere. Anyway, it's in here somewhere, or it's on the website. It will talk about the 40%, but that's where we usually run most of our races. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off our session, and we'll talk a little bit about the basic setup and the basic style of driving. Let me see. Next thing I wanted to talk about was what this is really for. So actually, I'll talk about that in the other video. The separate DAP session, driver assistance program sessions, will, I guess I'll talk about what they're for and what they're not. For this one, I'm going to just talk a little bit about how I would get a very baseline, just adjust the baseline. This isn't going to get into detailed setups. I will talk a little bit about some of the things I would do. But I want to put on my... Okay, I'm only showing the driver arms here so that you guys can see. I usually don't drive this way. A couple things about setups. Once you have your kind of your baseline setup, and you're going to go learn a track, go learn that track. Do not start tweaking your setup until you are within just a couple tenths, lap after lap after lap, very repeatable. Except for like your out laps. The first takes, depending on the track, it can take about 4 laps before the car really settles into a rhythm. Sometimes it's as bad as a full second on the first lap for on cold tires. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to just use the baseline, because that is probably what most of you are used to if you have not played with setups. And the first thing I'm going to do, because we are limited to 12 gallons, so here's an interesting thing about how I do this. I will flip back and forth between metric, because volumes, I will use the US system, but for most everything else, I use metric, because I don't like looking at weird numbers. So I'm going to put this at 12 gallons, because that's what we're limited to on most of our races. Some of them are higher, so you'll go through the same process with different ones. Before I did that, I needed to take some notes on what my cambers and stuff are, so that they don't get messed up here. So I am going to just take a screenshot real quick of this. Set that off to the side, because what I'm going to do is when I change my fuel settings, it will be changing my ride heights and cambers, etc. And so I want to put that right back to kind of where they were. Oh, joy. I didn't hold, please. I didn't check. I didn't get the whole thing. So try this one more time. Okay, now that we've got that straightened out, the thing I'm after first is I'm going to change this back over to gallons, plot my 12 in there, and then everything else I pretty much do in metric, I believe. Alright, so the first things first, I'm going to get that ride height. I want 63.5, so I have to raise this guy up a little bit. If I go there, it was 63.2 originally, so that's looking good. This is why I like metric, because I can just compare the 112.7 to 112.7. The other thing is the tires. I also use pounds for this, so it's pounds and gallons, and then everything else is metric. Go ahead and keep these. I think these are all the lowest. Go ahead and keep them the lowest. You can change these to try to even them out. Usually just even out the lefts, the fronts, and then even out the rears to each other. If you want, one of my teammates doesn't see much value and just runs 24 all the time. I typically balance them out, but for what we're doing here, definitely don't need to, and it probably doesn't matter a whole lot. Haven't done a lot of testing with that. So the next thing we want to do is check our rears. So our rears, we're at 69.1. So we will put us back to metric, 69.1. We need to lower this guy down. I should just do a couple clicks until it gets close. Uh, 69.1. So now it raised up my fronts. So I'm going to lower my fronts back down a little bit, and so you will see that changing one thing will change another. So this is when you're first doing this, it's kind of a pain a little bit. So now they're all looking even. Now the next thing I want to do is make sure my cambers didn't get changed. So they were -3 before. If they do, then you have to change your cambers, and sometimes you'll notice, like, watch, I'm going to crank this out, just be ridiculous on it, and you notice it changed my ride height. So you can play with that, but we're going to keep our cambers exactly the way the baseline was. Make sure you're clicking apply. It will auto apply like after a few seconds, but I'm usually not that patient. And the rears were at 3.7 and 3.6. Not sure why they're slightly off, but I'm going to leave them exactly how they were. The other thing we want to check, if we put our ride heights back to the way they were, it shouldn't change our toe. So our toe in here, we have 0.7 on the way toe out, which is actually less than I'd probably normally run. I usually run somewhere between -1 and -2. Usually falls about 1.5, 1.7. That's what I like to run for the fronts. The rears here are actually more than I normally run. If I was to change anything different from baseline for just starting off, I would change this to the lowest positive number, or maybe slightly negative. So if in this case it was 2.2, so let's see. Oh wow, I just forget it. When you do some clicks, it goes pretty far. So this is a negative 0.2. Negative 0.2 will feel different than a positive 0.8. Once you go from once you cross the threshold from positive to negative, you can usually feel that. But then it starts becoming less and less of a difference between, let's say, a -1 and like a -1.5. Once you're at 1 or 1.5, it's usually you're not going to feel the difference too much about that. But in any case, this is one thing I might change here. And then again, you change your toe, it's going to start changing some of these numbers. It didn't change too much. I wouldn't be worried about 69.1 versus 69. It's going to be as close as it's going to be anyway. However, I'm going to put it back to where it was, just because. And so this might be a little tail happy on braking. And if it is, you can change that. You can also change bias, but I usually would not want to throw more bias up front to counter the tail happy rear if you have toe out. So if you're too tail happy, I'd probably put this back and keep my bias where it is, because you keeping more bias in the front is going to burn those tires up. The other thing about it, you will have to adjust your bias back as the race goes on. Usually I run a little bit more bias than I need up front, so a higher percentage for the first lap, and then there's usually one turn that's like the catch me out turn. If I get through that and it feels like almost too stable, then I'll dial it back a couple clicks, and then the next turn or the next lap around, I judge it based on that corner. And if it's still really planted, then I'll keep dialing it back. You want to get it so it feels like the car almost wants to turn in by itself. If it starts to get a little bit uncontrollable, then you just bump it one click towards the front until it feels good. And usually after about, I don't know, 7 to 10 laps, I usually am not playing with the brake bias at all anymore. So it's usually those first 10 laps I'll be playing with it, and then after that it kind of settles down. I use brake bias. My teammate uses, or one of my teammates likes to use the brake valve. And so instead of dialing the brake bias, which is what we're talking about here, it starts off at 66. This is probably too high anyway, but I'm going to run it this way for the DAP session to start out with. This will usually drop down into 62. Maybe I even start at 62, and maybe the low I get is about a 59, 58 with a brake valve of 1, which is less pressure in the rear. So the brake valve, by putting more brake valve towards the rear, it's kind of like changing brake bias. iRacing apparently has this quote-unquote wrong, because what the brake valve apparently is supposed to do is change like the curves when you press the brakes. On a 1, maybe it's kind of like a linear, so the more you press the brakes, it's a 10% is 10% brakes, 50% would be 50% of how much pressure it would put in the back, whereas like a 6 might come on really slow and then it hits really hard at the end, or it's opposite where it hits really hard at the beginning and then kind of trails off. Not sure exactly what it's supposed to do, but I've done the telemetry on this where it is a linear curve, so it basically putting more brake valve in is the same. It basically just changes your percentage. So you can actually have, like, if these, don't quote me on the numbers, but if it was like 65 with a brake valve of 1, then adding it to 66 and a brake valve 2 is like the same thing. So it's like you increase the front by putting more bias in the front, and then you can also put more valve in the rear, and it basically keeps your brake bias percentage the same overall through the telemetry. But I like to use brake bias instead of the valve, just because I used to actually use the valve. That's how I started. But I actually switched over to using the brake bias because I just like, I tend to mash the brakes kind of too hard. So by not using the brake valve and dialing the brakes back, it gives me like a little more fidelity. Like, it forces me to push the brakes harder because I don't have the control that my teammate does. So what he will do is he'll actually run the brake valve back, and the reason for that is he doesn't want to change how the fronts feel. So different schools of thought on that. Anyway, Let me see if there's anything else I need to talk about with the setup here. And I wouldn't touch anything else. There's a few things here that I would not do, but none of this... I'll say this about the TCR setup. The setup for this car will change times, but usually it's such a small amount. Usually what you want to do is you want to get your laps, feel what a time is, and then adjust it for stability without sacrificing time. You typically aren't going to gain a whole lot. If you're looking to, like, if you're like feeling, oh, I'm a second off and I'm going to change the setup, you're not going to gain a second because of the setup. I'm not sure. I haven't actually tested this, but I could probably run some really wonky setup and be within a second of my fastest times. So anyway, let's see here, and there isn't a whole lot to adjust here anyway. So that's the other thing is, even if you change like the brake or this wall thickness, it was a 3. My choices are 2 or 3. I mean, you can only be 1 click off here. As far as the blades and all that kind of stuff, I'm not going to go into what these are, but there's not a whole lot of adjustment here. Probably the thing you can mess up the worst is your camber. You can run this like negative like 4.5 or 5 or something ridiculous. I generally don't. I'm usually running somewhere between like a 2.7 if it's an enduro type endurance thing, up to like a 3.2 if it's a sprinty thing. But generally, this is a pretty good. Maybe it runs a little bit more in the rear than I normally run, but none of this is like so far off that I would say, what are they thinking? Let's see here. I'm gonna save that setup. Alright, as far as driving goes, I'm going to turn the engine off here. You want to brake super hard in a straight line, and then you trail brake into the turn, just so you can ease into it, and use your brake to kind of get it to rotate around. If it starts to rotate too much, just give it a little gas so it should straighten up. You can counter steer here, but it's not like a rear-wheel drive car where you really have to crank that thing. Like if let's say I was going into a turn like this, and the back end starts to come around on me. I mean, I'm putting maybe like this much. I mean, you can barely see my hand down there. I'm not going to be changing this. I'm not going to be, crossing this thing up so much. I don't have to. You're not going to be counter steering like this to catch it. I mean, maybe in extreme cases, but. It's not like a rear-wheel drive car. Just give it a little gas and you should be good. So as far as the mid-turn or even turn in smooth, but I usually don't go more than 90 degrees. So if you have your hands on, if you're practicing or if you're going to watch this little guy down here, the steering wheel, kind of watch what you're doing. If you are doing this, I mean, I'm really trying to think hard of a track where I really turn this much ever. Maybe there's that kink at Detroit, maybe something like that. Maybe the first kink towards the end of Spa, maybe something like that. But I mean, it's going to be like this. If my hands are over here, generally, that's too far. So typically, I'm going to be coming in, and that's maybe right in that area. So try practicing where you're not turning in more than that. You won't notice it while you're driving. So watch your replays. Go watch, some of your laps and see what you're doing consistently. What's the other thing? As far as throttle goes, okay, my throttle does show up here. If I'm like this, I'm usually off the gas. Then what I'll do is it's kind of unwind it. So as you're getting back into the throttle, you'll notice as I turn, I'm also cranking left. So, or as I'm turning, I'm giving a little more throttle. So I can do this, and then maybe you can get to full throttle right around in here, and then you bring it out. But if you're like this and you're full throttle, it's going to do nothing but drive that front. In fact, I'll just do a little bit here. Alright, so that was an extreme example, but you can see, you can really throw that wheel around. I was in 5th gear, full throttle, and it was all the way locked, and it's not going to spin around. It also isn't going to turn you, so when you're going through turns, do not move that wheel like that. I think that's probably about all I have for my notes for driving styles. Let me see here. Yeah, that's about it. So I will see you guys in a DAP session that are track specific.